incidents of hate speech and misinformation have affected elections, for example, in Ethiopia and in Kenya. So really, how can we call for improved investments in safeguarding African elections by the big tech? While again being mindful that this should be a multi-stakeholder approach, we recognize the crucial role that social media platforms have to play. And so for the sake of this discussion, that is what we'll be exploring. So that's in terms of how do we hold big tech accountable. I'm London Kowani, and I'm the Campaigns and Partnerships Manager at Digital Action, and I'll be moderating this session. And with me today, I have Adrian Wanyama from CPESA, and I also have Silas Jonathan, who is a researcher and fact checker at Dubawa, Nigeria, but is also affiliated with the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. And shortly we'll be joined by somebody else online, who is Honorable Susan Dossi, who is a parliamentarian from Malawi and also a member of APNIG, which is the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance. So before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'll allow our panelists to quickly introduce themselves and then we can get into it. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name, as I said, is Adrian Wanyama, legal officer at the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa, which is commonly abbreviated as CPESA. So CPESA works towards using ICT as an enabler for improvement of livelihoods of people on the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. Over to you, Silas.
My name is Silas Jonathan. I am a development researcher at Dubawa, an affiliation of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. What we do is that we try to combine technology and see how that connects to the promotion of democracy, of course, in relation to the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those introductions. So to start off with you, Silas, and just to set the tone, Nigeria recently held an election. Would you really just paint the picture for us? What are your reflections on, the last Nigerian election, and in relation to tech hams, what did we see emerge from that election? So in terms of tech hams, what sort of activities, for example, were stakeholders engaged in, and so on and so forth? Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. The 2022 Nigerian election, I would say it's quite unique from the previous ones. Because it's the first time I would say that civil society, government, journalists began to see that social media and the internet itself has a lot of potential in the outcome of the elections. And it's so unique because some of the things that we have seen during the course of our work, which includes fact-checking and open source investigations, tracking who is saying what, some of the things that we saw that was so prominent was the use of bots. Now, bots are just automated that try to Facebook or Twitter. So that they influence conversations, they push narratives, and sometimes they make conversations trend. We've seen a lot of hashtags that were framed by a lot of bots. And what was so prominent, unlike the previous ones, was that in the last elections, we saw that a lot of systematically people try to influence conversations by creating groups, on Facebook and pages, just to fuel some narratives such as hate speech. tribe, regional, and of course, definitely, region. One thing that was very common during the election was, of course, the massive influx of dishonest information, which was primarily on social media platform. Before the election, one of the things that we were going to do was to check for trends and then to check for narratives. So what it means is who is saying what and why is this person saying this? So what we found is that it just happened by chance. There is a lot of these for this kind of narratives. And examples. Most of this information targeted either to disseminate the image of a particular politician or to target the integrity of a particular party. And one of the things we do again before the election was to also try to see what are the things that likely trigger chaos and hamper the electoral process, especially online. And during the election, we also had a situation where we did fact checking and we collected the data. And one of the things that was so striking after that was that out of almost 128 claims that we have fact checked, which is around this stage, which is around this information. Almost 80% of it was shared on social media, particularly on social media. And Twitter was so prominent then, and then out of all these claims that we looked at, we found out that I think 76% were targeted misinformation, not misinformation. Targeted misinformation means that it was organized to sort of read a particular narrative. Of course, we collected a lot of data as per groups, as per pages, as per Twitter handles, as per people who are pushing such narratives. Just to see, so in summary, one of the things I observed is that social media and the internet is becoming a cyber takes the large chunk of the influence online, and we've seen so many times particular hashtags such as for example, like we articulated some years back, but we've seen how it was the decider in conversations, in political conversation with Twitter forward.
Thank you so much, Silas. I believe we do now have a better picture of what transpired then during the election. So that's in terms of, you saw organized plans or groups, mobilizing around disinformation, as well as, it's encouraging to see that civil society and other stakeholders, including the government, are increasingly seeing that social media is now a decider of election outcomes. In moving along, while we still check for our online speaker, Adrian, moving over to you. So CIPESA is part of the Global Coalition for Tech Justice, which is really calling for social media platforms to protect people and elections. On that backdrop, could you highlight the need for tech accountability across global majority countries and in particular in African countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, the audience, for taking part in this. I want to take it on from where he stopped, and I want to draw your attention to specific aspects which we really need to understand that, technology has two folds of the roles it can, especially in electoral democracy. The first one is that it can enhance participation, and it can also shape the direction of elections, and it can also lead to really having a trusted and credible election. Secondly, is that when you look at social media and tech in a whole, these two can also partly be influencers of how, they can be influencers of actually how governments respond to electoral processes in as far as technology is concerned. The first bad angle is they come in to actually control how people use technology or social media during electoral processes. And we have seen this cut across the entire continent. For example, recently, while I thought the Zimbabwe election, at least I tried to follow the example of Kenya by not switching off the internet, we actually discovered they actually slowed down the internet so that they can try to minimize the flow of information and how people can actually be engaged or participate in the electoral processes. So that means that there's an aspect of what we call intermediary liability. The question is, when can actually social media platforms or technologies be held responsible for what they have actually done, for information that has gone through those specific platforms? That is one. So there is need for accountability, because otherwise they would be held responsible. The second thing is that from what I've discussed is that when people use social media and technology to spread information, and especially if this information is disinformation or misinformation or hate speech, I hope you all know the distinction between the terms. Disinformation is when they spread information knowing it to be untrue, but with any intent to cause some form of mayhem or cause hate speech. While on the other hand, of course, misinformation or false news could be sharing information, not caring whether it is false or knowing it is false, but with no intention to do any form of harm. So with that, you discover that social media platforms have to be engaged, because otherwise they have to be held accountable for wrong information that is spread through those respective platforms without unnecessarily taking the necessary precautions to check and also control quality, and also to ensure that information going through those platforms is actually accurate. And of course, this responsibility can also be driven from the fact that they also have what we call content moderators, because they know we must have these people to ensure that what goes out is actually true and correct and not really going to destabilize. The other thing is that, as I've mentioned, which we need not forget, is that social media is a big driver for disinformation, especially during electoral periods. People are able to use this as they wish, or to cause mayhem, as I mentioned, or hate speech. And of course, you know that social media has the capacity to reach millions and multitudes of people across the world in a trickle of an eye, or by just a click of your phone. I don't know, the phones have mouses, but by a click of a mouse, you can actually reach millions of people at a go. So this means there has to be some form of responsibility that must be drawn to social media platforms and other probably online content providers, but in form of shaping electoral democracy, such that at some point, because of the negligent acts or the reckless acts and omissions of these social media platforms or technologies, it should not be a reason for governments or states to weaponize what has happened to try and use it to limit freedom of expression, flow of information, or access to information, which usually in the end, most times leads in doubting credibility of the electoral process, as we've witnessed in most of the countries on this continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for those thoughts. Indeed, social media is a big driver of disinformation from what is coming out from this discussion, and indeed there's need for accountability. I don't know if Honorable Susan Dossi has joined us. Honorable Susan, are you there? Not yet. Okay, so proceed in our program. So speaking, of the need for accountability, how can we, for example, as civil society and other stakeholders, get more involved for collective action? We have identified this need, but how do we rally as a team? When we speak of big tech, we often, just even from the name big tech, we know that these are, powerful corporations. So what chance do we stand against them? So I don't know, do we have any sort of strategies to share in terms of how we could better get involved for collective action? Any of the speakers are welcome to pick it up.
The things I'm beginning to see is, and I would start by saying this, the that says fake information, hateful information spreads wider than quality information. And tech companies, specifically social media companies, we shouldn't forget that they are set up to perpetuate profit, to maximize profit. When such narratives are spread there, it sort of moves more to get involved and to share these narratives. It's more money for them. It's more action for them. It's more investment for them. So into collective action, then it has to start with collaboration. It's a coalition between experts, where the need is a technical coalition that will bring journalists together, media experts, and then even civil society, even governments. There needs to be a collaboration to sit and talk about this issue. Mr. Edwin, this information can be used to cause during elections. That means that nobody that is even identifying the flow of it is nobody identifying that means it will be unchecked on such platforms. It will be unchecked on the internet, unchecked. So what I'm seeing is that journalists have a responsibility to identify this trends, whether it is hate speech, whether it is disinformation. Journalists have a responsibility to identify it. Now, what's next? Journalists also have a responsibility to collaborate with relevant government agencies to say, this is how we can draft policies that will tackle these situations. I believe that it is collaboration between civil society, journalists, and government agencies. That's the we can bring social media companies into to take responsibility. But what I am seeing is that social media, civil society are on a different page, government agencies are on a different page, and when it's a decision, drive the policy on social media companies into the conversation because we tend to forget because they are primarily driven by profit, and conversations that drive profit is the one that will flow most on that. So collaboration is key. Yeah.
Thanks for highlighting that, Silas. In terms of multi-stakeholder collaborations, and hopefully Honorable Susan will soon speak to the government side of things. Yes, over to you again, Adrian. How can we better collaborate? And perhaps if you're able to briefly touch on some of the campaign asks of the Global Coalition on Tech Justice. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just to pick on from there, I also wish to draw your attention to the fact that we have the UN guidelines on business and human rights, which usually also at some point refer to as global compact principles, which aim to ensure that in doing business, there should be deliberate efforts to minimize harms on human rights. So as part of civil society, that's one of the things that we usually actually aim to do. And I also want to expound on what he said. He was so much mentioning journalists, but let's call it civil society, the tech community, the private sector, and other stakeholders who actually need to work collaboratively, as he mentioned, in order to ensure that things go on well, that technologies are held accountable, and that they do not actually commit acts which are used by government as weapons. Away from, in specific response to what she asked, from this coalition perspective, especially on as far as digital actions are concerned, elections and technology, there have been deliberate efforts, for example, to document practices on the outcomes of elections and the processes that have been ongoing to make sure that what is happening is used to actually create a platform for future accountability and for future well-informed electoral processes where technologies play a critical role without unnecessarily being looked at as probably instigators of violence or instigators of hate speech. And these practices, for example, include aspects of e-voting and how actually technology can be used to improve on e-voting, such as in countries like South Africa. And then similarly, there's been also efforts to push against common electoral related restrictions, such as the internet shutdowns or internet throttling, the slowing down of the internet, such that people can, that is what, for example, I mentioned earlier, that Zimbabwe actually did in the just concluded election, because without internet, you can talk about your social media, but once the internet is affected, it means also your social media, because social media actually depends on the internet. And then, of course, capacity building on elections and hate speech has been happening at the different national levels. For example, specifically in Uganda, under this particular domain, we had some capacity building meetings with journalists on how to effectively cover elections and try to minimize on cases of disinformation, and how to do fact checking, as he has earlier mentioned, and ensure that information which is out there is actually correct. And then finally, there's also usually the regional and international human rights mechanisms which are there for us to use. So we have been making use of this, such as the Universal Periodic Review. At Africa, we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and we have special rapporteurs that we can actually use to display or to open up some of these challenges that actually come with during elections, and also with the control of technology. So this is part of what we have been doing, and you need to know that the role of technology in elections is so critical, to the extent that where it is affected, it goes to the root of an open and transparent election. That means it affects the credibility, and people are highly in doubt of the outcomes of that particular election. So that's what we've been doing. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for highlighting some of the avenues that we can use to lobby big tech. Before we move into our final reflections, Silas, I'll come back to you. I mean, you've been involved in investigating, documenting some of these tech harms. What lessons do you have for countries with upcoming elections?
Oh, thank you very much. One thing that I've noticed is that each country is unique, especially in Africa. I've followed Kenyan elections. I've seen how speech is used. I was in Ghana 2020 during the elections. I've seen how party politics is used to spread disinformation against people. I was in Sierra Leone, so Sierra Leone election, which chief was made of hate speech across tribal lines. I'm currently that I'm seeing that is happening in the election in October. Some of the concerns that is there is also hate speech channeled towards this and disinformation. And there's a reason why I'm saying this, because information is used to fuel this information in Nigeria is not the case in Sierra Leone. So what I'm saying is that each African country has its own unique pattern of online harm or online style of causing harm. But then this is some of the things that we do. One of the things that we do before election is to establish a specific collaboration with media tech companies, particularly to the information need of that country. And let me give you an example. We had a collaboration with Meta in Sierra Leone, so that when we report any cases of harmful information from any account, they shut it down instantly. So this is what we were able to achieve, and we're also trying to do that in the upcoming elections in Nigeria. And then that we can do is also to establish collaboration. We're able to do that with in Nigeria. It's collaboration with civil society, that's also on the other side, and then with INEC or any electoral body. So most of electoral bodies are just coming to terms with the influence of the internet and technology in the electoral process. So we are calling for more collaboration with that, with to see we have a situation room that responds to online harm. And then one of the things that I specifically tell tech experts in the media space, in the civil society space, is to be able to start tracking patterns and trends on all social media platforms on the internet. What are the blogs saying? Who is saying what? When is this conversation? When did it start? What is happening? Have a documented trend. We have so many studies that we have done prior to the Nigerian elections that helped us to be able to determine what social media platforms should we focus on and what kind of collaboration should we look at. So it is important, whether it's civil society, whether it's government, to be able to particularly determine what kind of technology, information technology, is most prominent in a country. So in Nigeria, I can tell you that it is Facebook, a lot of TikTok. So you have to determine that. We've seen in Kenya have Facebook and a lot of Twitter too. So we need to determine first what kind of technology would be used to influence electoral or democratic conversations, and also whether it is INEC or electoral bodies, particularly Nigeria, INEC. I'm from Nigeria, so please don't mind me. But it's need to also have a bad actors list. The bad actors list are people who have a record of trying to cause harm to electoral process using technology. This is very important because you can now say this is who we are tracking. We have a list of election. We saw them posting election results that were not officially announced, and when we checked, it wasn't true. I'm a bit uncomfortable when there is an internet shutdown or slowdown, possibly because I am for freedom of speech at all costs. I know that is a bit extreme, but I think that is why we are having this conversation, to be able to have a balance and see where it is. So what are the key actions and what should organizations do? I've said it. One is collaboration to find a way to find a way to identify this. So not just civil society, I know too. Track these people, identify them, and have a bad actors list. You can bring the experts in and then create a bad actors list, which I've mentioned, specify the primary social media or information technology that may cause harm. Who is saying what and what is the trend about? I can tell you that during Nigerian elections, we have tracked so many conversations that are influenced and fueled by people living in Russia, in the UK, who seem to be in Nigeria at all, and we are the ones fueling that. And also, experts also need to conduct systematic social media analysis to be able to track data. What conversations are more chief in what part of the country, and how can we be able to track it? Because whether we like it or not, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, or whatever kind of harm on the internet or via technology comes with the dominant narrative at the time. So people don't just plug information from nowhere. They capitalize on people's biases and then make it the target of information. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Silas, for those reflections. I believe Honorable Susan Dossi has joined us. Honorable Susan, good morning.
Good morning. Apologies. I was.
Good morning. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning. I'm here. Good morning.
Are you able to unmute us so she can hear us? Honorable Susan, good morning.
Morning. Good morning.
Okay, she's in the room. I can see her from here, but it's frozen on our end.
It has frozen here. She can talk, but it's not audible. So I think it's problem with the speakers. So they are fixing it. She's actually talking
as
here.
we fix the audio, perhaps we'll now open up for further reflections from the audience, any contributions, questions, comments, but really we are reflecting on what's at stake for African democracies ahead of the 2024 elections. If platforms do not improve their safeguards, their policies, and if they don't provide any election plans for the countries that will be holding elections in 2024. Thanks. I see a hand over here. We can start here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Africa based in South Africa. So what I wanted to say is that in our context in South Africa, what we have been seeing since we took a deep dive into these issues, particularly since 2019, is that it's not just disinformation or false narratives. Indeed, as the speakers have mentioned, we've also seen, incitement to cause harm, incitement to cause harm. We've seen harassment and intimidation, particularly of journalists, and this has a gender dimension to it because it's women journalists who are targeted, and the target is both by online party supporters, but also political party leaders themselves, who also use social media to spread disinformation. There's this one example where this party in South Africa did what is called doxing. So he shared private information. It's mere information. He shared actual information, full information, but with the intent to cause harm of a senior journalist who's late now. She was the editor at a public broadcaster, the late Carolina Brown. And what happened is that she was very much harassed on all her platforms, emails, WhatsApps by political party followers. So obviously this hinders the freedom of expression, this hinders media freedom because it creates a self-censure for journalists, but also it hinders on the rights of others to access credible information when it comes to elections, so that citizens can actually vote for a party leader or a political party that they are well informed about. But also on top of that, we've also seen hate speech And this hate speech in South Africa manifests itself in sort of like a Islamophobic sort of context, particularly when it's close to elections. And obviously it's under the guise of illegal immigrants, but this term has been used as a blanket term to speak to any non-national that is in South Africa. And so that's what we have been seeing. And then in terms of a response to this, the speakers touched on this. I think it's very important for a multi-stakeholder approach between the private players, the big techs, government, and civil society. So we, as Media Monitoring Africa, recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the big tech platforms, Meta, I think Twitter as well as our elections body, IEC, to make use of an online platform. We use technology as well to combat disinformation. So we created this platform called the Rule 411. It's a public complaints platform where any member of the public can, go and lodge a complaint around any of the online harms that have been mentioned in this panel. So the IEC was very much happy to partner with us with that. And the results of that are obviously, because the tech platforms are signatories to this memorandum of understanding, there is quicker turnaround time in terms of when you flag content that is spreading online. There are more sort of recourses that are there, rather than when an individual goes and reports a post on their own. I just wanted to share those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Faith Joshua Oba, and I work for Lift for Citizens Development and Advancement here in Nigeria. So I wanted to also throw light on, ask the question rather on the internet shutdown, like Edwin had mentioned. We've seen an experience in Zimbabwe and also in Nigeria, where we had the situation with the Twitter. So my question then is, what practical steps are we taking in civil society organizations to ensure that there are no internet shutdowns in the forthcoming elections? If there are steps, are those steps being taken? If there are, what are those steps that are being taken? Thank you.
So I would like to add my question to Ghana. My name is Osei Keja from Ghana. Ghana will be having election this year. And we've seen platform shutdowns, as my young lady said, with Twitter in the case of Nigeria. We don't know what is going to happen. And we've seen that platform shutdown hinders digital citizenship and also is regressive. How do civil society journalists, how do we navigate our way? And in navigating our way, how do we hold government accountable? We've also seen, as in the case that my friend from South Africa mentioned, gender-based violence online. In the case of Ghana, we've had instances where women participation is very low, relatively low in sub-Saharan Africa. And women participation there's this targeted harm when they try to, say, get in these spaces, political spaces. There's this targeted harm where there are troll farms and all that. And in having accountability for these government institutions, civil society, and our personal data, how do we navigate this roadblock? Education, if there's digital education or digital rights education, what should be the structure? I mean, for the citizenry, how should we approach it? Thank you very much. Any more questions? Okay, so last question.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Thank you, everybody. My name is Guy Berger, and I'm here at AFIGF for Research ICT Africa. So I have two questions. The one is building a bit on what was said by my South African compatriot. The fact checking is usually looking at facts, whether it's true or false, but the package is more than that. It's important, but it's also when you have a combo, which includes fear and hate and a call to action. So, if you just take the American famous thing with Donald Trump, stop the steal, the steel is factually incorrect. Steel is, nobody wants to be stolen from, so it's emotional. And then stop. You know, that was the most powerful combination. And I'm interested if you analyze I would be interested if you can analyze, if in your analysis you're looking at the combo, because the combo is the most powerful than these things individually. Although the second thing I wanted to ask is that in looking at you have a new battery, another battery.
Oh, we can pay
the other thing is, in order to really monitor the extent how bots are working, coordinated campaigns, fake identity and stuff, you really need to get access to data. And these big tech companies give some access to data, particularly to Americans. And this research ICT Africa is trying to push for an African alliance for access to big tech data, especially at times of elections, to say these unequal standards must be ended and that there should be access. But then you need, like at Dubawa, you need like some big data analysts as well to have to crack this big data, to do the network, to do the analytics. So do you have that? What kind of partnerships, for example, with universities would you need to do big data analysis? Because I think it's only through that you can begin to see disinformation at industrial scale. Otherwise, you're just scraping on the outside and you're getting a few little nibbles here and there, but you're not getting the big picture.
Thank you very much. So we get some resources. We captured it well. It's how do we navigate some tech arms, for example, internet shutdowns, and what sort of combination of factors were you looking at when it comes to fact checking? I believe Silas, you can take that. You can, Edwin, you can take the one on internet shutdowns. And then following up, Silas, in terms of what access have you had to data?
Yeah, thank you very much for those pertinent questions. I'm going to respond specifically. The others, who are generally supplementing the discussion, but I want to respond to the question on how actually we can check on internet shutdowns, what can be done. Johnson, she asked that question. We are also always obsessed with the same questions in our heads because we are dealing with governments on the continent, and these governments are the ones that usually influence or make laws that will specifically work for them. But let me share a small example. Recently, when we were in Harare, Zimbabwe, just before the election, and we had a meeting with the officers. The people who are of the Ministry of ICT for that meeting. And I was the first speaker, and he was about to leave. So since he was about to leave, I spoke first, and after I posed to him a question he was supposed to answer, whether the shut down the internet during the election that year. I'm telling you, it was a very difficult question for him to answer. But he said, finally, he made a commitment. We do not intend to shut down the internet, but should things go out of hand, then our hands might be tied, that we'll have to come in and do some level of control. What I'm trying to say about here is that we need to be intentional in our advocacy of what we want to do. This business of having only civil society in a room with media, when you don't have the Ministry of ICT, you don't have telecommunication companies, you don't have internet service providers, what you want to happen may never happen because the very people who make the decisions are not engaged. They are not involved. So we have to be intentional and involve those particular people who always shut down our internet. Secondly, We have also seen litigation to work. Yes, it takes time, but it really works in some countries. So litigation alongside international and regional human rights monitoring mechanisms. This can be embarrassing to countries, that is one, when decisions are made against them and when also their human rights record is tended to be very ugly and bad. So they will always try as much as possible to measure up and ensure they do not do what will taint their image further. If you remember Kenya, we always have campaigns online. Keep it on, keep it on, keep it on. Kenya, this election is coming up, please keep it on. And there are hashtags which are running. All these may appear not to be working, but they really put pressure on governments because they're in the international domain and they'll be able to respond and ensure that they actually do not shut down the internet because it will change their image. So in short, we have to be intentional in our advocacy, targeting people who actually make these decisions, but we can also make use of litigation way beforehand, and we can also make use of the regional and international human rights mechanisms. But one assurance I can give you is that these governments that we have, they can do whatever they want at any time, but we cannot let them go on and do whatever they want. We have to show that we are also resilient in what we are doing. We are fighting relentlessly to ensure that whatever they do does not fundamentally affect our rights and freedoms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And perhaps I may also add on the strategic litigation. So one of the things that we did in Zambia prior to the election, and I remember that was the evening before the election. So we made a speculative submission to the High Court asking that the regulator should not shut down the internet. I remember that submission was made at 10 p.m. The courts were open at 10 p.m. The night before the election. And of course, the judge threw it out. She said, this is speculative. What proof do you have that, the regulator will shut down the internet? And lo and behold, the following day, while people were casting their votes, the internet was cut. We made a submission again, and that was upheld. So while strategic litigation does take time, it took us, I'd say 48 hours. In 48 hours time, the internet was restored. And of course, 3 months later, the court upheld that decision and they asked the regulator to shut down the internet again and to inform the public within 36 hours of any such incident. So they entered into a consent agreement with one of our local human rights organizations. So I just thought to add that. Ahead, prepare your paperwork. So when it happens, you are at the doors of the court. Thank you. Silas, over to you.
Yeah, so sure, I think there was a question here. One thing that I appreciated from the question I got from the back was, and I want to be sure I get it right, is fact checking is not enough because there are other devices that will fail on the category of fake news. And that's why we said a combination of combination of gender violence, but on the there's many things aside this disinformation and misinformation, and sincerely, fact checking is not enough. That is why what we're doing these days is to move away from fact checking to open source intelligence. And what that requires is that you're not just, because when you're doing fact check, you're trying to find the verdict. Is this true or not? But when you move a step ahead to open source, you're trying to find out the why. So you're trying to find out why, who, and what is the motivation behind such narratives. So I think that I would totally agree with most of the submissions that there is, and now I would respond to that, is that there is a new requirement for a new skill that would be able to meet that challenge, that new challenge of narratives of unique kind of harms that we're seeing online. I can tell you that 10 years ago, even the terms mis and disinformation were not formulated. It's like hydra. Online harm is like a hydra. Once you cut another head, another one pops up. And so there is a new requirement for a new skill, especially in the field of open source investigation. And that is why this also leads me to the question that you have asked, because when you are seeing these gaps, what is now ahead is saying we cannot get effective data to be able to respond to this in a larger scale. And I can tell you that it's one challenge that those experts in the civil society, especially particularly in response to online harms, are facing. I remember writing a lot of letters, filling a lot of documents to get Twitter's API, and it wasn't forthcoming. And there are third-party tools. So how I respond to this is how we've been able to get lots of data is third-party tools. There are a lot of third-party tools that are paying the social media platforms to be able to access their API, and you pay for their services. So, for example, there is tools that can be able to offer you who is in a particular hashtag, from what region is it coming from, and who are those pushing for it, and who is in the center of that. There's a data where there are third-party companies who are working with access to APIs, but you need to pay. And it costs a lot of money. I think that's why one of the challenges in accessing data in the civil society, the governments can anyway because they are the government. But the challenge of accessing data these days has gone beyond even thinking whether the data is there or not. The data is there. It's just that it costs a lot of, there's a price tag to it. And when Elon came on Twitter, there are a lot of free tools that Twitter that were affiliated to Twitter that researchers could access. But now all of them have been cancelled. All of them, the API access have been retrieved and they are no more existent. Some of them that are still afloat are now free anymore. There are some charges to Elon Musk. So, of course, accessing data straight away from big techs or internet companies or tech companies is a little difficult for civil society, but third-party companies are really sprouting up, and tools such as CrowdTangle has helped us a lot in trying to establish this connection between who is saying what. And then I remember a tool that we use, Hoxie. It's a Twitter-related tool that is now not accessible. It's a tool that will be able to determine who is at the center of what conversation on Twitter. And I also agree with what you mentioned on a collaboration. Did you mention the universities? Yes, there is a need for knowledge in a large scale knowledge that would not just only because they would not only pick out this information as just a topic, but as a thing of concern, where governments would rise up, oh, this is it, this is that. When there is a connection between university, such large knowledge, I think that it's a really valuable thing to do. But again, it still goes back to the expense of data and then the inaccessibility of accessing data straight away from the big tech companies. And finally, I want to say something about the internet shutdown. I think the internet shutdown is relating to what country? I have seen how the internet and social media in particularly has offered ordinary citizens the ability to hold INEC accountable, the ability to hold security forces accountable during elections. So say, this is what is happening in my community right now, right here. You know, we need you to come and do something. I have seen banks respond to people about something that went wrong. I've seen INEC, electoral bodies, respond to queries instantly. So internet shutdown, I am totally not for it, but I think that if you notice our conversation in this room, what is shouting out here is policy, policy, policy. There is a need to draft out a policy, like Asiya said, with the input of everyone, so that the government don't just take advantage of the citizens and shut down the internet to their own advantage. There's a lot of call even in Ghana, in Nigeria, governments are trying to pass social media bills that is totally biased, that would shut down the voices of civil society and people. And most civil societies are fighting back and say, oh, no, that's too aggressive, that's too extensive. And they're trying to come up with better policies that would, but it's still not equitable. It's still not viable, because some of them are not even imputable with the tech companies. So it's a nuanced conversation that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of insights too. If we just look at the side of the civil society and say, don't shut down internet, I think it's shallow. If we say we allow government to shut down internet during election for the sake of election, we are shutting down people's voices to share what is happening. And then we allow people to share whatever they want during the election, they could also share something that will cause harm. So it's a lot of nuanced conversation here.
Any last questions, reflections before we close? Any last inputs? Okay, go ahead, please.
Hello. All right. So you did mention policies and all, but with regard to internet shutdowns, and I do believe that most countries have signed on to treaties and say conventions, international conventions, UN declarations and all that. But we've seen the case of Gabon recently, where they were having elections and there was a shutdown, and the very president was calling for this throttling of the internet, which he shut down for people to rise when he was captured. The irony. But most countries have all signed to these declarations and all, but they are not accountable to it. So if you are drafting policies or making efforts, what makes, or say, how are we convinced that with these policies they are going to be committed or they are going to be implemented? If they
good question. And I particularly like this question because I am sure, I'm not sure, but I am tilted to the belief that why you ask this question is because there are a lot of policies that are not, the policies have been put together, but they're not actualized. A lot of them, you say, they've been actualized. Sincerely, let's look at this. When the internet is shut down, who benefits best? It's the government, especially a chaotic one, especially a chaotic government. I like that you mentioned the Gabon situation where, it's funny, but that is the situation. But what is in a situation where there isn't even a good policy document that calls for it? A lot of African countries, a lot of civil societies or African countries don't even have a quality policy document that responds to how the internet or online can be balanced to profit government, to profit citizens, to profit the civil society. It's just usually the government pushing for something, or they want to pass a bill, or they want to. So when you look at all these conversations we're having, even in this conference, you would see that our best bet is the policy. I mean, at the end of the day, we can go to the moon and come back. All we can do is to put the policy in and then hope that something happens. And you see, that's why elections are crucial. So we can get good leaders so that when the policy is drafted, they implement what is being practiced. And I like what you said particularly, that we shouldn't have conversations in a room where we do not have government direct government representatives. And look at it in African politics. Look at it. When African politicians are campaigning, they don't talk about politics, policies. They just talk about good water, infrastructure, hardly. But when you listen to the US elections or you listen to the debate, you see that they don't talk about these things, it's policies. You know, when you're in power, what do you do about social policies? So I think it supposed to be a learning for citizens, citizens to understand that when we are demanding is that an effective policy, that politicians shouldn't just come to promise infrastructure and this. We should start conceptualizing effective policies that we can tie it to a politician and say, this is what we want from you when you come to power, not just infrastructure or water flowing. So sincerely, if I have to come back to your question, when we discuss it all night, we still come back to policy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those submissions. I believe we've come to the close of our discussion this morning. I'm mindful that we need to quickly grab some tea and of course go to the opening ceremony. And apologies, we've had a technical challenge, so our third speaker will not be able to share her reflections, but we were going to hear from her, someone that's coming from government, someone who is a parliamentarian, and of course a female politician. That said, I think what is really clear from this discussion is the need for a multi-stakeholder approach that really involves everyone from private sector, civil society, government, and all the other stakeholders. The need for improved policy and legislation, but also besides just providing that policy legislation, also looking further into the actual effective implementation. Also, the need to counter some of the challenges when it comes to accessing data for investigations. And what really stood out for me really was the need for new skills or for capacity building in terms of how we understand, investigate, and document some of these take-home so that we're able to provide the right evidence even as we approach the big techs. So thank you so much to our speakers for an insightful discussion. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all the contributions. We've come to the close of our discussion. Thank you. One last thing. So I left a lovely card for everyone. Please feel free to go through it, interact with it. Like I earlier mentioned, I'm from Digital Action and we're leading on a global coalition for tech justice. A global coalition for tech justice. So you're free to just scan that QR code if you'd like to learn more about that coalition or if you'd like to participate and join. Thank you very much.